Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to part 15 of our study of the Exodus. Let's begin our study this morning by inviting the Lord's blessing on this meeting. Thank you, Abba, for this time that you've given us in your word. Thank you for all the things that you show us there that become a source of blessing and challenge. We ask that your spirit open our minds and our hearts to the things that we'll see this morning, for we ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, Exodus part 15. We continue our study by looking at some of the laws that were part of the Mosaic covenant. Elaboration on these laws can be seen in both Leviticus and Deuteronomy. Their purpose was to establish Israel as a righteous people of God, assuming they followed the detailed instructions of the covenant. Sometimes they did, sometimes not so much. The Mosaic covenant, what we call the law, was made with the whole nation of Israel. Failure under the covenant would result in discipline for the nation, including even being kicked out of the land and into bondage again, as did happen. However, God's objective was to incentivize them into righteousness. He promised them great blessings if they did meet the terms of the covenant. Some of the warnings of discipline we see in these details are directed to individual Israelites as carried out by judges. However, some specified disciplines are clearly directed to the nation collectively when that discipline is seen as administered by God and not by human judges. Chapter 22 that we're about to start in continues where we left off with the laws of restitution. So, Exodus 22 and verse 1. If a man steals an ox or sheep, and kills it or sells it, he shall repay 5 oxen for an ox and 4 sheep for a sheep. If a thief is found breaking in and is struck so that he dies, there shall be no blood guilt for him. But if the sun has risen on him, there shall be blood guilt for him. He shall surely pay. If he has nothing, then he shall be sold for his theft. If the stolen beast is found alive in his possession, whether it is an ox or a donkey or a sheep, he shall pay double. These regulations deal with the theft of animals. And these verses expand on the eighth commandment. If a person stole and then killed or sold someone's ox or sheep, he must compensate for the loss by returning same kinds of animals. Payback is salim, and it means to repay a legal obligation. Here again was retribution in kind, but 5 head of cattle had to be paid for the loss of 1 ox and 4 sheep for the loss of 1 sheep. Probably this heavy compensation was to deter animal theft. If, however, the stolen animal was still alive, the remuneration was less, but still costly at twice the value of the stolen animal. If the thief is caught in the act of breaking in and is, quote, struck as he dies, the owner suffers no blood guilt. That is, he's not guilty of some form of homicide. If, however, the thief is discovered during daylight hours, it is assumed he intends no physical harm, and it is forbidden for the owner to kill the thief. The thief, however, must pay, and if he cannot, he can be sold into slavery. If the stolen animal is found alive in the thief's possession, he must pay double. Verse 5. If a man causes a field or vineyard to be grazed over, or lets his beast loose, and it feeds on another man's field, he shall make restitution from the best of his own field and in his own vineyard. If fire breaks out and catches in thorns, so that the stacked grain or the standing grain of the field is consumed, he who started the fire shall make full restitution. So, if the grazing rights of a farmer are violated by another animal's livestock, or if a fire destroyed another's crops, the offender had to make restitution from his own fields. Thorn bushes were common in Israel and often burned easily, and thus helped spread fires quickly. The Mosaic law strongly affirmed the right of both life and property. Verse 7. If a man gives to his neighbor money or goods to help to keep it safe, and it's stolen from the man's house, then if the thief is found, he shall pay double. If the thief is not found, the owner of the house shall come near to God to show whether or not he has put his hand to his neighbor's property. For every breach of trust, whether it is for an ox, for a donkey, a sheep, for a cloak, or for any kind of lost thing of which one says, "This is it," the case of both parties shall come before God. The one whom God condemns shall pay double to his neighbor. If a man gives to his neighbor a donkey or an ox or sheep or any beast to keep safe, and it dies or is injured or is driven away without anyone seeing it, an oath by the Lord shall be between them both to see whether or not he has put his hand to his neighbor's property. The owner shall accept the oath, and he shall not make restitution. But if it is stolen from him, he shall make restitution to the owner. If it is torn by beasts, let him bring it as evidence. He shall not make restitution for what has been torn. In the ancient Near East, there were no banks, so personal property was sometimes given to a neighbor for protection. The one who received someone's valuables, whether it was goods or clothing or animals, for safekeeping, was responsible for them. If personal valuables were lost and no thief was found, the one who kept the goods had to prove before the judges, that is, come near to God, as is stated here, that he did not steal them, or he had to make restitution by paying double. If an animal in safekeeping was injured or lost, the one taking care of it had to give evidence that he was not negligent, or he had to pay for the loss. Verse 14. If a man borrows anything of his neighbor and it's injured or dies, the owner not being with it, he shall make full restitution. If the owner was with it, he shall not make restitution. If it was hired, it came for its hiring fee. So what we have is when an animal was borrowed, the borrower was responsible for its safekeeping. But if the owner was not present when the animal was injured or died, the borrower had to pay for the loss. He was responsible. But if the owner was present, then the borrower was not culpable. If an animal was rented and injury occurred then the owner's compensation was the rent money. Now we're going to look at some laws about social justice. Exodus 22:16. If a man seduces a virgin who is not betrothed and lies with her, he shall give the bride price for her and make her his wife. If her father utterly refuses to give her to him, he shall pay money equal to the bride price for virgins. So these statutes elaborate the seventh commandment. Unmarried and unbetrothed daughters in Israel were considered part of the father's property. Consequently, the loss of the daughter's virginity diminished her value, and therefore compensation was due to the father. If an unengaged virgin submitted to seduction, the male was to pay the bride price and marry her. Normally, the parents of the girl were paid a fee, a bride price, at the time of betrothal, which ratified the engagement. If her father did not want his daughter to marry him, the man was still obliged to pay the bride price, but he got no bride for it. The seduction of a girl who was betrothed, however, resulted in stoning for both parties. Deuteronomy 22:23 says this: if there is a betrothed virgin and a man meets her in the city and lies with her, then you shall bring them both out to the gate of the city, and you shall stone them to death with stones. The young woman, because she did not cry for help, though she was in the city, and the man, because he violated his neighbor's wife. So you shall purge this evil from your midst. We discussed this before. The Jewish marriage process was different from ours today. The father of the prospective groom negotiated a bride price for the young virgin. With that agreed upon, they made a contract for the two to marry. That contract legally bound them as man and wife, even though they would not consummate the marriage for some time, perhaps months or even a year. The betrothed virgin was legally married, a legally married woman under the law. It is assumed that since the woman did not resist, that is, she didn't cry out for help, then she is also guilty of adultery. Exodus 22:18. You shall not permit a sorceress to live. Whoever lies with an animal shall be put to death. Whoever sacrifices to any god other than the Lord alone shall be devoted to destructions. The three sins mentioned in these verses merited the death penalty. They anticipated Israel's struggle against the worship of idols. The first deals with female practitioners of sorcery, telling the future or controlling others by demonic power, which figured prominently in the Canaanite Baal worship. Witches and wizards were not permitted to live because they were in league with the demonic powers that operated in the godless regions of the nation around Israel. God also condemned sexual intercourse with animals. Not only were these practices part of the heathen worship of idols, but they debased human sexuality, which is a precious gift from God. And the third deals with sacrificing to any god other than the one true God. Moral imperatives, Exodus 22:21. You shall not wrong a sojourner or oppress him, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. You shall not mistreat any widow or fatherless child. If you do mistreat them, and they cry out to me, I will surely hear their cry. And my wrath will burn, and I will kill you with the sword. And your wives shall become widows, and your children fatherless. If you lend money to any of my people with you who is poor, you shall not be like a money lender to them, and you shall not extract interest from him. If ever you take your neighbor's cloak in pledge, you shall return it to him before the sun goes down. For that is his only covering, and it is his cloak for his body. In what else shall he sleep? And if he cries to me, I will hear, for I am compassionate. You shall not revile God, nor curse a ruler of your people. You shall not delay to offer from the fullness of your harvest and from the outflow of your presses. The firstborn of your sons you shall give to me. You shall do the same with your oxen and with your sheep. And 7 days it shall be with his mother. On the 8th day you shall give it to me. You shall be consecrated to me, therefore you shall not eat any flesh that is torn by beasts in the field. You shall throw it to the dogs. The material in Exodus 22:21 through chapter 23, verse 9, is usually taken to be detailed statutes. However, several factors suggest that it should be distinguished from the precepts that are found in 22:1 through 22:20 that we just looked at. First, this section is marked off from the surrounding material by the frame that's formed by 22:1 and 23:9. Both verses not only prohibit the mistreatment of aliens, but they also underline this by reminding the Israelites that they were once aliens in Egypt. Secondly, the way in which the material is presented does not correspond with the two distinctive forms used in the previous section. Rather, it's reminiscent of the form that's adopted in the Decalogue. And thirdly, God is seen as the enforcer in verse 24 when he says, I will kill you with the sword. There is no other mention of penalties enforceable by a human court for breaking the rules outlined here. The stated laws here must be seen as collectively for the nation of Israel, and any discipline would be upon the whole nation because of national failure. Yes, they apply to the individual Israelite, but the nation will suffer for national disobedience. And fourthly, the subject matter of this section is distinctive. It encourages both a caring attitude towards the weak and vulnerable members of society, that is, aliens and widows and orphans, the needy and the poor, and a concern that the legal system is totally impartial. Those involved in disputes are to favor neither the rich by accepting a bribe, nor the poor. Everyone, irrespective of their class, is to be treated equally. A witness must not be swayed by social pressure and should ensure that his or her testimony is truthful. These observations suggest that we're dealing with moral imperatives rather than detailed laws. So, the commands found here seek to encourage a standard of behavior that goes beyond the letter of the law. A human court is unlikely to prosecute someone for failing to return his enemy's strayed animal. Nevertheless, God demands that his people overcome evil with good. In the light of the special relationship being established between God and the people, it's significant that in the middle of this section is the command, you shall be consecrated to me. This is how God's holy people should live. Exodus 23:1. You shall not spread a false report. You shall not join hands with a wicked man to be a malicious witness. You shall not fall in with the many to do evil, nor shall you bear witness in a lawsuit siding with the many so as to pervert justice, nor shall you be partial to a poor man in his lawsuit. If you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey going astray, you shall bring them back to him. If you see the donkey of one who hates you lying down under its burden, you shall refrain from leaving him with it. You shall rescue it with him. You shall not pervert the justice due to your poor in his lawsuit. Keep far from false charge, and do not kill the innocent and the righteous, for I will not acquit the wicked. And you shall take no bribe, for a bribe binds the clear-sighted, and subverts the cause of those who are in the right. You shall not oppress a sojourner. You know the heart of a sojourner, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. The above is about setting standards for behavior and not necessarily legal issues. Do unto others, in other words, is basically what it's saying here. These admonitions, which expand the ninth commandment, deal with the need for impartial justice in lawsuits. They spell out obligations to treat all men justly and with compassion. The words enemies and the one who hates you refers to a legal adversary. One, false testimony was forbidden. This could be testimony that slandered a righteous man or freed a guilty man. A witness was not to allow himself to be swayed by the majority view or to be influenced by the destitution of a party against whom he might testify. Two, taking advantage of an enemy was forbidden. His straying livestock was to be returned to him. In an emergency, such as a donkey collapsing under its burden, the enemy was to be assisted. Three, perversion of justice was forbidden. The poorest of men was entitled to a fair trial. False charges against the innocent was to be rejected. Those who lied in court and thus brought about the execution of an innocent man would not be accepted by the law. Bribes to judicial officers or witnesses were forbidden. Bribes blind the eyes to truth and twist the words of testimony. And four, oppression of foreigners living in the land was forbidden. Israelites were never to forget their own experience as aliens in the land of Egypt. Now we shift to laws about the Sabbath and festivals. The material in this section is carefully structured, falling into two halves centered around verse 13, with each half subdivided into two parts. The first half deals with the seventh year and the seventh day. These three features are worth noting. First, most of the material in this section anticipated the Israelites enjoying a settled agricultural existence in the land of Canaan. To a fugitive slave, these instructions must have implied prosperous times ahead. Secondly, the observance of the Sabbath was exceptionally important because it was a sign of the covenant that was established between God and Israel. Anyone desecrating the Sabbath was guilty of renouncing this special relationship with God. Consequence was death. And thirdly, the Israelites were reminded of their obligation to worship God alone. Make no mention of the names of other gods, or let it be heard on your lips, according to 23:13. The second part of this section stresses the worship at the heart of the three annual festivals that celebrate God's benevolence towards Israel. Israel's religious festivals were tied to the agricultural year in a series of sevens. The seventh day was the Sabbath, and the seventh year was the sabbatical year. Exodus 23:10. For 6 years you shall sow your land and gather in its yield. But in the seventh year you shall let it rest and lie fallow, that the poor of your people may eat, and what they leave, the beasts of the field may eat. You shall do likewise with your vineyard and with your olive orchard. 6 days you shall do your work, but on the seventh day you shall rest, that your ox and your donkey may have rest, and the son of your servant woman and the alien may be refreshed. Pay attention to all that I have said to you, and make no mention of the names of other gods, nor let it be heard on your lips. The Lord instructed Israel concerning the sabbatical year and the Sabbath day, which expanded the fourth commandment. The sabbatical year was the seventh year of a series of sevens. For the first 6 years, the Israelites were allowed to plant and harvest from their lands. But the seventh year was set aside to allow the land to rest and recover. Whatever crops came up naturally were left in the fields to allow the poor to glean from them. It served to remind Israel that God owns the land and it was theirs merely as a trust. Leviticus 25:23 tells us that the land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine, for you are strangers and sojourners with me. The weekly Sabbath not only reminded the Jews that they belonged to God, but it showed God's care for the health of man and beast. By resting on the seventh day, man and animals could be refreshed for another 6 days of work. The sabbatical year gave the land the opportunity to rest and restoration. God is concerned about the way we use the natural resources that he has graciously given us. Exodus 23:14. 3 times in the year you shall keep a feast to me. You shall keep the feast of unleavened bread. As I commanded you, you shall eat unleavened bread for 7 days at the appointed time in the month of Abib. For it is you, for in it you came out of Egypt. None shall appear before me empty-handed. You shall keep the feast of harvest, of the first fruits of your labor, for what you sow in the fields. You shall keep the feast of ingathering at the end of the year, when you gather it from the field, the fruit of your labor. 3 times in the year shall all your males appear before the Lord God. You shall not offer the blood of my sacrifice with anything leavened, or let the fat of my feast remain until the morning. The best of the first fruits of your ground you shall bring to the house of the Lord your God. You shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. Here God gave instructions for 3 agricultural festivals to be held annually. The first one was the Feast of Unleavened Bread in the month of Abib, and that was roughly March or April, depending on how the calendar fell. And that's about the time of the barley harvest. Second, then we have the Feast of the Harvest in the spring at the beginning of the wheat harvest, when the first fruits of the crops were to be given to the Lord. And thirdly, we have the Feast of Ingathering in the early autumn, which falls in September to October. The first of these great agricultural feasts was a memorial to the hasty exodus from Egypt. The second feast, in which 2 loaves made of new grain were presented to the Lord, was also called the Feast of Weeks, because it was celebrated 7 weeks, 50 days after the Feast of Unleavened Bread. In the New Testament, it's called the Day of Pentecost. The third festival, the Feast of Ingathering, is at the end of the agricultural or civil year, was also called the Feast of Tabernacles or the Feast of Booths. These were constant reminders to Israel of God's provisions for his people. So 3 times in a year, all adult males in Israel were supposed to worship at the tabernacle, and of course later at the temple, with grain and animal offerings. When an offering was consumed on the altar, it had to be without yeast. Only the best of the crops, first fruits, were to be given to the Lord. The prohibition against cooking a young goat in its mother's milk may have been because of the religious practices in which the Canaanites cooked goats in their mother's milk in a fertility rite. God did not want his people to partake of anything related to idolatrous worship. In the Feast of Ingathering, the Israelites may have been tempted to follow the common Bedouin practice of cooking the meat of young goats in goat's milk, whereas the young goats should have been left with their mothers. In other words, perhaps the prohibition meant that the Israelites were not to take what was intended to promote life, goat milk, and use it to destroy life. This stipulation may be the basis of the present Jewish custom of not mixing milk products with meat. All right, now we have conquest of Canaan was promised. The section beginning at 2022 has a comforting promise about God's directing his people into the promised land, wherein the laws just enumerated would be practiced. It contains promises of cursings for disobedience and blessings for obedience, similar to those that are found in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. Exodus 23:20. Behold, I send an angel before you to guard you in the way and to bring you to the place that I have prepared. Pay careful attention to him and obey his voice. Do not rebel against him, for he will not pardon your transgression, for my name is in him. But you carefully obey his voice. Do all that I say, then I will be an enemy of your enemies and an adversary of your adversaries. When my angel goes before you and brings you to the Amorites and the Hittites and the Perizzites and the Canaanites, the Hivites and the Jebusites, and I blot them out, you shall not bow down to their gods, nor serve them, nor do as they do, but you shall utterly overthrow them and break their pillars in pieces. You shall serve the Lord your God, and he will bless your bread and your water, and I will take sickness away from you. None shall miscarry or be barren in your land. I will fulfill the number of your days. I will send my terror before you and will throw into confusion all the people against whom you shall come. And I will make all your enemies turn their backs to you. And I will send hornets before you, which shall drive out the Hivites and the Canaanites and the Hittites from before you. I will not drive them out before you in 1 year, lest the land become desolate and the wild beasts multiply against you. Little by little, I will drive them out from before you until you have increased and possessed the land. And I will set your borders from the Red Sea to the Sea of the Philistines and from the wilderness to the Euphrates. For I will give the inhabitants of the land into your hand, and you shall drive them out before you. You shall make no covenant with them and their gods. They shall not dwell in your land, lest they make you sin against me. For if you serve their gods, it will surely be a snare to you. Although these verses describe events that will take place when the Israelites come into the land of Canaan, the form of speech is striking. On the one hand, most of the promised action is God's, not the people's. God will send an angel, and he will fulfill their days, send their terror into the land, drive out the inhabitants, set the borders of the territory of his people, and give them the land to inhabit. On the other hand, these pledges depend on their obedience. God will be an enemy to the enemies of his people if they obey him. He will take sickness away if they serve him. And their possession of the land is related clearly to their devotion to the Lord alone. They are not to make any covenant with the Canaanites or the gods of the Canaanites. This is very clearly the language of the covenant, in which the covenant king will bring his people into the land, just as he said to Abraham. In doing so, the king, in his strength and by his grace, will fulfill his promises to his people. To that extent, the covenant is entirely a covenant of grace. Yet, there are elements of conditionality within the covenant. While its fulfillment is not entirely dependent on the obedience and service of the people for them to enjoy the full benefits of what he is to do for them, they must obey. The king is looking for obedience from his people, not as a reason for which he will act on their behalf, but as a response on their part to what he will do for them. The Lord promises to send an angel to lead them. Who is this angel that God promises to send before them, to guard them on their journey, and whom they must obey? This is the same angel of the Lord that appeared to Hagar in Genesis 16:7, and Genesis 22:11 and 15 appeared to Abraham. This angel is both distinguished from God, yet speaks as God. More importantly, Moses' great encounter at the burning bush was with the angel of the Lord. Here, the Lord's name was revealed. And here God says of the angel that my name is in him. In other words, the presence of the angel is the presence of God. The remarkable thing is that this angel would speak to them and lead them to the land. In a wonderful supernatural provision, God himself will be among his people, setting his commands before them, leading and guiding them, and enabling them to possess the land. God will gradually give them possession of the land. The fear of God, like the sting of the hornet, will cause the inhabitants of Canaan to run and flee. The borders of their inheritance shall extend from the Red Sea in the southeast to the Mediterranean Sea in the west, and from the southern desert to the Euphrates River in the north. The possession of the land of Canaan will mean that the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Canaanites, the Hivites will be driven out of the land. And this raises an important moral question about ethics. How can it be right for God to dispossess the dwellers of Canaan to settle the Israelites there? Further, how can it be right for God to blot them out? God is not showing any capriciousness or malice against the individuals who live in Canaan. He's dealing with them as an entity, an entire race. That, however, does not really solve the moral dilemma. The Canaanites were dispossessed as punishment for their own wickedness and idolatry. In Genesis 15:16, God said to Abram that his descendants would inhabit the land when the iniquity of the Amorites would be complete. Now God's moving nearer to fulfilling that promise. The Canaanites will lose their land through sin. The Israelites will possess it through grace. The Lord intends to have a holy nation in the world as a testimony to his existence and faithfulness, out of which a Savior for the whole world would come. The Canaanites would have been a threat to that purpose if they had been permitted to live in the midst of the Hebrew nation. These incorrigible degenerates of the Canaanite civilization were a sinister threat to the spiritual survival of Abraham's race. Exodus 23:33 told us, they shall not dwell in your land, lest they make you sin against me. For if you serve their gods, it will surely be a snare to you. That story, however, will unfold as God fulfills his promise and the Old Testament history runs its course. And that's where we'll conclude this morning. And I'll open the floor to thoughts or questions. Come on, Dave, you got something.
Well, I have always something, but my first question is a little sensitive, and so I apologize on this for all the people that may not sit right. But I find it curious that if a man violates a virgin, he has to either marry her or pay the price of a bride. If he violates a betrothed virgin, he's put to death, correct?
Yeah,
Okay, so it's two different forms.
yeah.
And that a man owns his daughter. So that's where this comes from. But my question comes in throughout here, prostitution is everywhere. You know, it's throughout, it's throughout, and it's never actually condemned that I can see. And I'm not supporting prostitution, so don't think I'm going there. My question is a woman is a daughter of somebody, and if she's a prostitute, what does I can't wrap that around my head how that's possible, but we know it was going on in this period. And I don't know whether anybody has any view there. Uh, I understand what was read, but this issue of prostitution puzzles me because it's throughout the Old Testament and even in the New Testament. Jesus, actually faces the adultery and the prostitute. So, but anyway, that was one thing that I struggle with. It's not a big deal. It's just I'm trying to figure out why is why this is prostitution even allowed, and it doesn't appear it should be. But anyway.
I actually that's a good question. And as you were spelling it out, I was thinking about it, trying to figure out how would I answer that. And I think the best answer I can come up with is that, yeah, you're right. Prostitution existed. Was it condoned? I wouldn't go there. Was it overlooked sometimes? Yes, I would go there. Um, Laws are there and they say this will happen if this. However, this doesn't always happen if that. In other words, they're not always enforced. And Israel was famous for not following the covenant. And part of the reason for the existence of the covenant was to prove that they weren't going to be righteous.
Right.
That failure under the terms of the covenant was going to happen.
Lane
Yeah, Collins.
and Dave, um, you may recall the story of Saint Nicholas. Nicholas was a bishop in the Turkey region, and Nicholas is reputed to have heard about a man dying, and his three daughters were going to be sold into prostitution because of the death of their father. Dave, the Nicholas is the legend is that Nicholas redeemed those three girls by placing on the windowsill 3 bags of gold, so as to enable that mother not to have to sell those three daughters into prostitution. Now, Dave, you may know that you may have heard of the tradition of a pawn shop having a sign above its door outside of three hanging balls. And those three were in honor of the three bags of gold that were used to redeem the girls. And a pawn shop essentially is a business of lending, pledging, and hopefully redeeming the pledged item. So that gives you a story that was some people say, the origin of Saint Nicholas becoming Santa Claus, Nicholas Claus, and the tradition of having gifts given at that particular time. I tie all this together, Dave, to help you as a way to remember that it wasn't just 2,000 years ago or longer that if a father died, that his daughters were facing the real risk of having to be sold into a life of prostitution. And hopefully that will give you an appreciation for the understanding of the nature of how important it is for a family to care for one another. And some people say that that was also the birth, if you will, of life insurance.
It's an interesting view, and I agree with what you're saying, Collins. And my point goes back to and the reason I justified it in being allowed by God, because it was one of the few areas a woman could actually make a living, because they weren't allowed to really
connection. So I think it's the internet is telling me I've said enough.
I said, really, I agreed with you. I think it's one of the few things that a woman had left if they had no husband or had no father. It was the only occupation that they had, because they weren't allowed to learn or go to school or anything else. So it was probably allowed for that reason. And I kind of thought of it the same way, but Collins brought it to light. And I had heard the story of St. Nicholas, but I didn't remember it. So I'm glad he brought that back up. All right, next question, Lane. This issue of extracting interest and not charging interest on the loan has come up in some sermons and things. And so there's some confusion around this term, you shall not extract interest from the poor, or you should not charge interest to a brother. You lend them money, but you never charge interest. Yet that's not enforced in the Jewish community. I mean, they're financial wizards, right? They know how to make money off of money. And so this whole idea of extract interest from the poor, I've heard it said, not from days of old, but I've heard it said that from commentators that this extract interest is usury interest, not any interest. And I didn't know whether, we may have some attorneys on here. I know we have Collins, but is this usury interest you should not extract, or you're prohibited to charge interest against someone who borrows against you that's a brother or sister, or they are poor?
My understanding is that the reference is to other Israelites, your brothers, that you shouldn't charge them interest. Now, as you pointed out, the Jews are often involved in finance, and there's a reason for that. back during the days of the persecution and of the Jews back during the 1400s, whatnot. They were driven out of other trades, and really the only trade that was left to them was loaning money. And that's one of the reasons why the Jews have tended to be in that area of financial loans, and because it was the only thing left to them to do to make a living. My understanding is that the prohibition is against collecting interest from fellow Jews, but there is no prohibition against collecting interest from Gentiles, non-Jews.
Yeah, and like I said, it's not a big deal. I've just heard it said different ways. I come to the conclusion, right or wrong, that I think it's talking about unfair interest. It's which we if you look at our credit system today, it is somewhat unfair. While I understand the financial risk, the fact is that the poorest of people pay the highest of interest rates. They're the biggest risk of repayment. I understand that, but that's just the way that it operates today. So in my opinion, I've come to think of this extract interest is really usury. It's taking advantage and charging more than you should be charging, but a fair price, a going price, a standard price, there shouldn't be prohibited. So anyway, that's just the way I look at it. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but it's just something that's come up, and I've never gotten an exact answer for it, but this gives us more input. The thing I'm still struggling with, maybe you can help explain it, is I'm to dedicate my firstborn. What does that mean? My firstborn son?
It's to Jews, not to Gentiles.
Well, but so is that law no longer? But what did that mean even for the Jewish community? They dedicate their firstborn son to God.
Yeah,
couldn't grasp what that really meant. So anyway,
it doesn't mean a sacrifice if that was entered your mind.
It doesn't mean a sacrifice. I know that, but it's just interesting that is there, and I couldn't get clearly. Of course, I haven't done any study on it, so let me take that aside and look at some commentary. The thing I found interesting too is that again, this is a question. I don't expect you to have an answer, but maybe somebody on the call does. Is sabbaticals, work week, sabbatical year. How do you live if you don't plant crops for a year? How do you work, if you don't have a day of work on Sunday and people have to buy something? So here's my answer for that. I'm not saying it's right. God implemented that for a good reason. Your land should rest, and it should rejuvenate by really fermentation and rotting, and the soil should get its replenishing so that you can have crops again. But it doesn't say that every field rests at the same period. So I have this field that's on a 7-year cycle. I have this year's on a different 7-year cycle. I have this year. So it's pieces of land that are continuing to rest. The same thing goes for sabbatical work. I don't think we work 6 days and all of our days start on the same day. We work 6 days and we rest a day. Well, that may be Tuesday through, Tuesday, or maybe Tuesday through Monday and I rest on Tuesday. That allows the constant working of the fields, the constant working, but also institutes God's provision for sabbatical, for rest. Does that make sense or not? Or am I missing something? And I'm not talking about worshiping God on the Sabbath, the Jewish Sabbath. I'm talking about the idea of a sabbatical week where you work 6 days, you rest one day. That day should be a worship day, I agree, of rest. But that doesn't have to be a Sabbath day. It doesn't mean everybody's on the same work week. Anyway,
I don't think that's correct.
okay.
I think the intention was that there would be the same week and the same year for everyone. The same day of the week and the same seventh year for everyone. Understand something. This is part of the Mosaic covenant. And the Mosaic covenant is a conditional covenant. And the unstated condition here is that you will be obedient to all the other aspects of the covenant. As a result of that obedience, Israel would be blessed abundantly, and taking a day off and taking a whole year off, you would have made enough, accumulated enough wealth and enough crops in storage to survive the sabbatical year without having to go and grow anything. Now, you were allowed to glean whatever was already in existence, which just came up naturally. And the purpose of this was to make, to drive obedience, one, and two, to provide for the poor and those who did not have the means of supporting themselves.
Yeah.
So the key is understanding that the relationship here behind these commandments.
Right, I understand, and I'm not comparing it to the Jews. The Jews was a Sabbath day of rest, and that's all the same day. What I'm trying to say, and I'm probably not presenting it right, I think God is presenting us with something here, and we take it as you did. This applied to the Jews. I'm taking what he said, and it applies to each and every one of us today, whether we're Jew, Christian, or whatever. We should let our land rest 1 year out of 7, and we should take a day off of work. We shouldn't be working 7 days a week, and because that's going to lead to bad. So I think the implication is that we can use this to apply it for today. And that's what I'm trying to say, is that I think it's beneficial to use God's word, not the way that the Jews were required to use it for obedience, but because it's just good advice, I guess.
Okay, I'm on board with that.
That's what I was saying. Yeah.
Let's
not miss the advice here because we're trying to apply it to the Jewish world. I think the advice here applies to the whole world, his creation, whether you be Jew or not.
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
And in that sense, I totally agree with you.
Yeah.
And you're right. The practice of letting fields lay fallow is beneficial to the fields. And it's a practice that farmers use today.
Right.
But they get around some of that with fertilizer.
The last thing I'm going to say, because we're out of time, is the importance of these feasts. We overlooked the importance of the feast. I did, I know, for a long time. But what I see is in our current generation, if we didn't have the 4th of July to celebrate our independence, you think any of our children would ever recognize 4th of July anymore?
No.
That's what these feasts were for. It's God's way of keeping our generations to come to go back and remember what their forefathers, foremothers, whatever you want to call them, did before them. And that's the reason for these feasts. It's the reason for our holidays. So let's not overlook the fact this is a way to keep God in the generations going forward and not forget what he has done for us. And quite honestly, the United States, in my opinion, have gone so backwards, forgetting what God did, with the beginning of the United States and the forefathers. But I'll shut up because we're out of time.
Bingo, we have a winner.
Yeah,
Brother Johnny.
Johnny has his hand up.
Loving this conversation. Thanks, Colin, for that comment that you put up there. But I did have a question. It may be a comment, but I do have a question where you said that the Canaanites were disposed as punishment for their own wickedness and idolatry. And the Israelites will, at least Abraham's descendants, will inhabit the land when the iniquity of the Amorites would be complete. Isn't that true for every single nation to heed that warning when your iniquity as a nation gets to the point where God says, that's it? Just a question.
No, that's very true. And there is a principle called the client nations,
Yeah.
which we'll at some point get into.
Mhm.
And client nations have an obligation to God.
Mhm.
And the idea of a client nation is very similar to the covenant relationship that God had with Israel. And we'll dig into that subject at some point in the future. But
I
you're right.
remember you did a good piece on that, on the client nations. I forget which one it was.
But we're a client nation to God right now.
There you
And
go.
that status is getting very shaky.
I
I
agree.
really,
And when it does, God will take that nation out and move his client nation somewhere else. One of the key requirements of a client nation was to provide a place of refuge for the Jews during the diaspora. And when the nation fails to do that and turns against the Jews, that's usually the last straw. And unfortunately, this nation is turning against Israel.
Dave, you got any property that I can buy in Puerto Rico?
No, you're not buying mine. That's all I own.
Find me a spot.
Problem is, it's part of the United States as well, so it is U.S. territory.
I know.
We just can't vote for president here.
Why?
We
That's
can't.
not right.
I know we can't.
Really? I didn't know that.
No,
Puerto Ricans don't vote for president.
as a citizen, which we are citizens of Puerto Rico, we had to do that for many different reasons, but we can vote for president now.
So good luck, y'all.
Good luck.
So you can't come back to the United States and vote.
No, we're
No.
residents of Puerto Rico, so we don't, we can't.
Can't do it. Once you proclaim Puerto Rico as your state of residency, then you have no right to vote even though we go back to Louisiana. Anyway, we don't need to go down that road.
I hear you.
Well, I'm not sure how well that works. My eldest son has not lived here since 1990 something or the other. 95. He's still on the voter rolls. He lives in Texas. He's registered to vote in Texas. He has applied telling the state of Louisiana, I don't live there anymore. And I just got a voter card from him in the mail the other day. So he could come over here and vote too.
Yeah.
Well, it is Louisiana, what can I say?
All right.
Say no more.
Ladies.
All right.
Let's close up with a prayer.
All right.
Thank you, Abba, for your marvelous word and for your marvelous grace and all the marvelous things that you have in your word to show us. We ask that as we go through this week, that your spirit bring to mind some of the things that we discussed and that we saw in this study, that they might become a source of blessing and challenge. For we ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Lane. Great study.
Lane, can I ask you one question off the record?
Sure.
Is considering about the women question, was there an age where they got to that they were not under the authority of their father when they still lived in the house, or had they get I don't understand that. Even in their culture, how you still had to be under such authoritarian rule. Was there an age of accountability, or when you reach that, you're on your own? Or can you explain that a little bit more, even for that culture?
That's a good question. And I don't have what I'm going to say is a dogmatic answer for it.
Okay.
My suspicion, and this is speculation on my part, my suspicion is that an unmarried woman remain with the family forever until, as is her, the mother and the father are going to pass on, and she'll be a like a widow. That's my suspicion.
Yeah, I was thinking about, okay, if she went out and got a job or started doing something, like I was thinking of Lydia, making the purple and all this other kind of stuff. If you could sew or you can do your own thing and got your own house, seem like that will kind of release. I was just thinking that I ain't got no answers. I'm gonna start digging.
Well, there's the obvious option that they could sell themselves into indentured servitude.
That's true. Bond servant, right? Okay, that makes sense.
Was Lydia Jewish or Gentile?
I may be Gentile because of Paul. I'm just.
I know she's the first convert in Asia, right?
Okay.
Or Mesopotamia, wherever.
That's
maybe
a good
Europe.
point. Yeah. So those laws wouldn't apply.
But he might have met her because there was no synagogue and the women were down at the thing. I have to go back. I'm that's fuzzy for me. But I'm wondering if she was a Gentile, and if she was, I would think that they might have had some different.
Who are you talking about?
Lydia.
Lydia?
Yeah, she had a job.
She was the purple dealer, and she was quite wealthy. And they don't mention somebody else, it's her.
Right.
And then so I was wondering, was she Jewish or Gentile? Maybe I can find out.
I don't remember.
Probably Gentile more than likely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm looking. She's a Gentile. It says she was a Gentile, but she was, and that's why I was confused, but she was kind of aligning herself with the religious practices of the Jewish women, because I did remember that she was found at the river where they were meeting, because where she was too small to have a synagogue. You had to have X number of men before you could have a synagogue. And I think that I don't know if it's 7 men or 8 men. You had to have a certain number of men before you could have a synagogue. And where she was, they didn't have enough men. And so the women would meet at the river and kind of worship and whatever.
Okay.
We'll look that one up again.
All right. Thanks.
Interesting. Cool stuff.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.